Well, it's really nice to be here. It's great to visit Duke. Duke is one of these places that's very much in the lexicon of tropical biology. It's a place I've wanted to visit for a long time, and I'm a little bit, in some ways, astonished that I haven't managed to make it here up until now. But believe me, it has been on the top of my hit list for a long time. So it's very nice to be here, and it has been a rather compressed schedule, but it's been fun talking about some of the work that we've been doing. What I'm going to do now is tell you about some work that we've been doing, trying to look essentially at the viability of tropical protected areas. And the genesis of this thinking about this really came about when I got really upset with one of my colleagues, Joe Wright, who he's a good friend of mine, but he's also annoyed a lot of people, including notably Stuart Pym, because Joe has challenged a lot of people's thinking about tropical extinctions, and basically he produced it's become rather infamous, and some people might describe it as famous or infamous paper in Biotropica now, which basically suggests that because of forest regeneration and increasing urbanization trends in developing countries, that a lot of the discussions about tropical extinctions are probably really overwrought and overstated, and he believes that in fact many fewer species are likely to go extinct than many people have traditionally suggested. As you could possibly predict, this has gotten various people discussing lots of different things. And one of the things that I became interested in was sort of turning this question around. So Joe's talking about, he believes that a lot of species will be able to survive out in the human-dominated landscapes, like secondary forest, fragments of forest, exotic tree plantations and so he has a lot of faith in the adaptability of tropical biodiversity. I sort of wanted to turn the question around and ask, well, if things are really so adaptable, what's actually happening within our arcs of biodiversity, the tropical protected areas? What kind of a job are these doing in terms of trying to preserve tropical biodiversity? Because I'm certainly less cavalier, I think, in many senses about what's going on. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about this work, which is still very much a work in progress. And we're probably about a little over half, maybe 2/3 of the way through data collection here. I'm probably going to show you about half of the data that we're ultimately going to collect. We've actually had a big debate about this whole issue up in Washington recently. And one of the points I want to emphasize is that I think Joe Wright, when he's talking about biodiversity, he's thinking quite narrowly in the sense that he's only worried about global extinctions of species. And I think most of you would probably appreciate the fact that there's going to be an awful lot of loss. Biodiversity encompasses species, but it encompasses a lot of other things as well. Of course, below the level of species, there's a tremendous amount of geographic variation within many species. And of course, we can talk about subspecies and populations. And within populations, there's a great deal of genetic variability, demographic variability, behavioral variability, other kinds of variation that's oftentimes distributed across the landscape, oftentimes in complex ways. And it can have a whole range of ecological, environmental, and historical factors which can be driving this complexity. Also, of course, species are oftentimes integrated to varying degrees within functional communities, and then there's ecosystems and biomes. So there's many levels when we talk about biodiversity. We're not just talking about species. I think is a little bit simplistic. For example, the tiger is effectively extinct across 98% of its geographic range, but it's still clinging to survival in some small areas. According to someone like Joe Wright's thinking, that species is still here, but in fact it's in many senses ecologically extinct throughout most areas in which it would have formerly occurred. So I think that to me represents a significant loss of biodiversity, even though that species may still be, or in some cases still surviving in zoos, but not yet completely vanished from the earth. So anyway, just a little bit about tropical reserves. One of the good news, bits of good news, of course, is that there's been an increase in tropical reserves in the last couple of decades. And I think if you look at across all the IUCN categories now, the figures are something like 10 or 11% of all tropical areas, if you're not including indigenous lands and you're not including forestry reserves, things that will be subjected to logging. But this is a significant increase. And if people are guilty, if some people have been guilty of, in some cases, perhaps excessive hand-waving when they're talking about projected tropical extinctions in the future, and some people, have suggested that as many as, for example, 75% of all tropical species, might vanish within this century. I mean, that's obviously a devastatingly high kind of figure. And even if some of those have been fairly hyperbolic, at least you can say they have achieved in some sense some victories in expanding the number and the sizes of tropical nature reserves. So that's the good news, is that there has been an increase in protected areas from around 3 or 4% to 10 or 11% in the last couple of decades. But the bad news is, increasingly we're seeing in many parts of the tropics there's not going to be much old growth forest surviving outside of protected areas, surviving outside of reserves. Many ecosystems and regions, if you break things down into more subtle kinds of environmental variation in terms of geomorphology or other kinds of environmental gradients or various types of habitats, you see that a lot of these ecosystems or ecotypes are not well represented within reserves. And also many reserves, of course, can be vulnerable to external threats. And so there's a whole range, of course, of panoply of different kinds of external threats that we can be thinking about. And some of these are, in fact, internal threats in the sense that they're penetrating into reserves. But habitat loss, fires, climate change, roads, hunting, exotic pathogens, just to name a few of the sort of obvious examples of ways in which reserve viability might be threatened by processes along the margins of the reserve or outside the reserve or in some cases penetrating inside the reserve. So there's a lot of things that could be going on. Now, one of the big problems is, we're becoming very sophisticated at using remote sensing, at, looking at things from outer space and inferring environmental change. And I'm just cited some notable papers here. For example, Ruth DeFries and her colleagues' paper, which is showing that many tropical nature reserves are becoming increasingly isolated because of a lot of encroachment and habitat destruction in the habitats around the reserves. Greg Asner's work showing how much that logging has been increasing in the Amazon, much, much higher estimates there than, for example, the government was claiming. Nadia Laporte's work showing this huge explosion of logging in the Congo Basin. Joe Wright, who's the fellow I was just mentioning, Joe Wright's work showing that in areas where you've got a lot of problems with poor governance and poverty, that there is higher rates of incidences of fires within reserves in countries having those kinds of characteristics. But obviously what we're doing is inferring a lot from outer space. What we're really lacking in many cases is more robust information about what's actually happening ecologically on the ground. These are much more difficult data to collect, and in particular what's difficult is to collect them in a consistent way. What we have is, for example, if you talk to experts, you can find a bunch of people that if you talk to all of them together, you can figure out that there's been a lot of things happening at La Selva in Costa Rica, or you can talk about changes that are happening at Yasuni. But it's very piecemeal, it's very heterogeneous, and it's difficult to draw any sort of broad lessons, broad inferences from those kinds of data, the very kind of piecemeal data. So our goal in this study has been to try to get at some of these more general questions by looking at a whole series of reserves. And so basically, here's our four main questions we're trying to ask. First of all, very broadly, will tropical nature reserves function just broadly as arks for biodiversity and for natural ecological processes? Are different reserves changing? Is every reserve sort of changing in its own unique way? Are they all just idiosyncratic and heterogeneous? Or are there common themes? Are there common patterns of environmental change plaguing these different reserves? What's driving the changes? And also, of course, what are the biggest gaps in our knowledge? So those are the four things that we're mainly trying to get at with this survey. Now, I have to immediately tell you, quite honestly, that the study is based on bad data. And you all know, of course, CAT stands for best available data. And here's our basic research design. So we're trying to look at 60 tropical reserves around the world, 20 each in the African tropics, the Asian tropics, and the New World tropics. They're all tropical rainforest or dense woodland. We could obviously, there's many different sites that one could potentially include, but we're having to focus here, we need to focus on sites that are better studied. And so one of our criteria is that there must be at least 10 publications per site out there. And our time frame is we're attempting to make inferences over, say, the last 2 to 3 decades, approximately. In some cases, there's longer time scales than that. In a few cases, we're dealing with sites in which most of the research has maybe been in the last 10 or 15 years. But that's our nominal time frame right there. Now, we're sampling expert knowledge. We actually sat down, or I had a very good intern who sat down and I said, find out, and I used La Selva in Costa Rica as an example of this because it was one of the best studied tropical sites. I said, find out everything you can about La Selva based on the published literature. And so she spent a long time and ferreted out just hundreds of papers from La Selva, and then went through and tried to extract the principles or the lessons in terms of what kinds of environmental changes are there. Then we interviewed, and I think we interviewed 5 or 6 people from La Selva. And and that took about a small fraction of the time of digging up all that technical literature did. And guess what? We figured we learned a lot more talking to the experts than we did going through all that literature, because the experts are, of course, integrating a lot of this information. They're communicating among themselves. There's a huge amount of unpublished information that they're essentially integrating, and they're also just picking up a lot of things that may or may not ever be published. And so we really quickly came to the conclusion that although there's drawbacks, and if you talk to people who do survey data, this is a whole other conversation, but if you talk to people who do survey data, there's various drawbacks in terms of using surveys, but there's also, fortunately, 4 or 5 different techniques that one can use to internally check for consistency, for saturation of information, that type of thing, which we're going to ultimately be employing. We had a very detailed, these poor people, we promised them collaboration, which I think I may end up regretting someday, because we're going to have about 300 co-authors so far on some of our papers. But we had them do a very detailed questionnaire, 6 pages, and then we always had either a face-to-face or phone interview, because all of our questionnaires are open-ended. We ask them to do certain types of qualitative and quantitative statements, and then we have a lot of information there. And we really find that following up this interview with an actual phone conversation or face-to-face interview is very informative, very helpful. And we only include within our analysis here things in which people indicate that they can indicate low-level confidence, moderate confidence, or high confidence. If they indicate low confidence, in fact, there's 4 levels: speculation, low confidence, moderate confidence, high confidence. The bottom 2 levels just get dropped off completely. I mean, we may look at these for some things, but it will simply be indicated as speculative information. And everything I'm talking to you about now, people have said that they've either got moderate or high confidence before we include them in the survey. So we're asking people about a lot of different things about these sites. So a total of 35 different ecological features, including 24 different functional groups or guilds, I'll refer to these guilds, broadly speaking, of species, 8 different invading or disturbance-loving groups, and 3 different ecological processes, which are forest dynamics, seed predation, and seedling predation. And then a total of 21 different environmental drivers here. And we actually asked them several questions about each one of these things. So I'm not going to go into all this stuff. I'm just going to sort of focus on some of the main patterns that we have so far. And I think these data I'm going to tell you now are based on something like 160 or 170 interviews so far. So here's the sites. You can see we have sites in West Africa, in Central Africa, Congo Basin, some of the sites along the eastern arc of forests here, and one site in Madagascar. So they're sort of distributed across sub-Saharan Africa. Have sites in South Asia and Indochina, in Southeast Asia here, and a couple of sites in Melanesia, Australasia here, sort of distributed throughout the Australasian region, or Indo-Pacific region. In the Neotropics, we have Central American sites. We've got one site in the Caribbean region, several in sort of the Amazon or the Andes region here, and then one site down here in the Brazilian Atlantic forest here. So again, sort of distributed around the place. If we look at the size, there's a huge variation in the sizes of these different protected areas. You can see here ranging from a little over 100 hectares up to 6.3 million hectares, so a huge amount of variation here. The average is about 400,000 hectares. A little over 3/4 of these are over 10,000 hectares in area. So, on average, most of the sites are not tiny, but there are a few sites here that are coming in, or some of the sites are coming in smaller size categories. So, but a lot of variation in area among these different sites. So first I'm going to talk about the functional groups of species and sort of go through here fairly quickly some different functional groups. First I have to say a little bit about how we make inferences about whether there's change happening, and this really has to do with our null hypothesis. So what we're asking people, and the data I'm going to show you right now have to do with the abundances of different guilds, okay, simply the abundances, and whether these have changed over the time span in which that identified expert has had experience within that site. And so you can possibly have an increase in the abundance of a guild, no change, or a decrease. So one of the questions we first have is, well, if there's really no change out there, what would our null hypothesis, should the data look like? Now, one of the things you could probably argue is, well, that most of the experts, or all of the experts, should say no change. But that assumes a couple of things. First of all, it assumes that your experts have perfect knowledge about what's happening out there. The other thing that it assumes that you could imagine in some cases you would have, let's say, for example, the abundances of a particular guild that might be fluctuating over time, and whether or not someone thought that was either stable or increasing or decreasing would depend on the time frame in which they had experience with that particular site. And so in some cases, again, depending on what's happening with the environmental variable, what's happening with people's imperfect levels of knowledge, and what's happening over the time frame in which they've got, you could also imagine a situation in which your null hypothesis might look like this, in which there's equal numbers of increasing, declining, and no change. And I would argue that I don't think we know which of those two possibilities. I think if we look across all these sites, given the huge amount of potential scenarios, I don't think we know which of those two things would be the realistic null hypothesis. In fact, I think either one of those could happen. And so what we've adopted is a very conservative, what I think is quite a conservative approach to the analysis. And we've said basically, to be considered statistically significant, you got to clear two hurdles. Okay? The first hurdle is you've got to have a deviation from this pattern right here. There has to be a significant deviation from a pattern in which there's no overall difference. And also, you can't have a situation in which the deviation is simply caused by the fact that you've got more sites showing no change than you would expect. Okay, so there has to be a deviation from random expectation. Use the G test and Williams correction for sample size for that. Then, if you cleared that first hurdle, in order to be statistically significant, there has to be a significant deviation between the frequencies of increasing and decreasing. You need to have more increasing than decreasing, or vice versa. Okay, and that has to be statistically significant. Again, using a G test or Fisher's exact test in order to determine significance. So both of those criteria have to be satisfied before we consider something to be a significant trend. Okay, so I think that's important because I think it imparts a level of conservatism in the analysis. On the one hand, there might be things going on out there that we miss, but on the other hand, I think we have more confidence when we do say that there's a significant effect. So I'm just going to mainly focus here on guilds in which we've seen some evidence of a significant change. And again, this is using available data across all of our sites. And one of the issues, which is actually not turned out to be as problematic as we thought. So for example, we might be talking about Yasuni, or we might be talking about Barrow, Colorado Island, or we might be talking about the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project in central Amazonia. We are interviewing multiple experts, and we're asking them, do you think the predators, large predators, apex predators, have declined? And of course, you can imagine situations where some of them say, yes, they have, and others say, no, they haven't, and others say, I don't know. But it turned out we haven't been as troubled by this as we thought we might be initially. We were trying to come up with lots of complex rules about how we would decide with majority rules, and what if this person says that they are, but they're only a little bit confident, and this person says that there's no change, but they're really confident. How do you balance all that stuff out? Turned out it hasn't been that bad. There's been more consensus than we were initially thinking we would find. So at least there seems to be a fairly high level of consistency. And we do have rules, which I'm not going to talk about, but we do have rules which we use to decide when we've got conflicting experts. The bottom line is, when we look at, so this is the number of sites in our survey that we have data for now. I think it's at least 2 expert opinions so far. And this is the number of sites increasing in abundance, in which large predators are judged to be increasing, no change in decreasing. You can see here there's a significant excess of sites with decreasing predators based on the experts. So that's saying that, of course, there's variation among different sites, but overall, there's a significant excess of sites showing a decline in our large predators. Now that we've sort of explained all that, you can see the same kind of thing happening, an even stronger pattern here for our large non-predatory species, and this includes things like tapirs, peccaries, elephants, cassowaries, large species which are not carnivorous in our sites. So overall, these are being judged to be declining strongly in many sites across the world. Primates are also another group that in general are being judged to be declining. Again, there's a lot of variation. For example, if you go in the neotropics, you'd see, for example, things like howler monkeys oftentimes cling to survival very well, but other species which are hunted or are more sensitive to other kinds of environmental degradation might be declining. This was a group that we actually expected to increase. These are the so-called, what some people refer to as mesopredators. These are things like raccoons and quadrumundis and baboons, which can sometimes explode, in some reserves when you take out the top predators. These generalist omnivore species oftentimes increase. That's the white-tailed rat from tropical Australia. But we're seeing no overall change here. We did expect these things to increase in abundance, so we expected to see a lot of those things happening because we know in many sites we're losing our top predators. We haven't seen that. Understory birds are a group that are pretty much regarded in many studies as being sensitive to forest fragmentation and logging. And in fact, although many sites are not changing, we are in fact seeing more sites decreasing than increasing than we would expect by chance. So there's many of these understory species that specialize for living down in the understories of the forest canopy. Many of these are insectivores. They have big eyes. They're they're clearly adapted for low levels of light, and probably pretty behaviorally specialized and physiologically specialized. And in general, these are declining. Same thing for game birds, which would be hunted, although that's just marginally non-significant there, but I think it probably will be with larger sample sizes. Large frugivores are clearly declining. Again, in all these cases, or many cases, we have a lot of sites showing no change, but we do have an excess of sites showing a decrease relative to an increase here. And many of the large frugivores need to move at large distances across landscapes in order to find enough fruiting resources at any one time of the year in order to keep the populations going. Amphibians, of course, as you should probably all know, seem to be quite sensitive to environmental change. And of course, there's this chytrid fungus now, which is wiping out many species. But we see here no sites are stream-dwelling amphibians thought to be increasing. No sites at all, and they're thought to be declining or not changing in other sites. Stream fish is another strong pattern here. You see that many sites, freshwater fish, are being judged to be declining by our experts. Very few are they increasing or no change. So that's a pretty strong pattern there. These changes in freshwater systems. And then migratory species, of course, which is a very eclectic group here. If you include everything like elephants, which could be moving between coastal and inland areas, forest elephants in coastal and inland areas in Africa, various types of migratory fish, a lot of bats and birds in the tropics move up, and insects move up and down elevational gradients at different times of the year in response to phenological changes in fruiting and flowering resources. And overall, this group is judged to be pretty vulnerable to environmental changes. And then we get to various groups that seem to be doing very well, thank you very much, and things like disturbance and light-loving trees, so this include a lot of pioneer species. Most sites are thought to be increasing quite substantially in abundance. Lianas and vines, which also many lianas respond positively to forest disturbance. They like to have pioneer trees, oftentimes that they'll use as trellises or tree fall gaps in order to ascend up into the canopy. These seem to be increasing in a lot of sites. Invasive plants is another group that's also doing very well. All kinds of things, everything from kudzu to mimosa to water hyacinth and many other kinds of species. Invasive animals, things like the bloody great cane toad from tropical Australia, feral pigs, which are invasive in some parts of the tropics. These are the fire ants. These are thought to be, according to a recent paper, thought to be invading forests in tropical Africa 60 times as fast along roads as they're invading intact forests. So if there's a road there, they're really, and I've been in places where they're very noxious, very painful when they sting you. In fact, there was a paper in Biotropica showing a leopard that was blinded by fire ants, and evidently in an area where there was high populations of them, and they really are virulent when they sting. Diseases also are judged to be increasing. For example, if you see that some of the malaria vectoring mosquitoes, I think it's Aedes aegypti, there are oftentimes very strong increases in abundances in human-modified habitats versus intact habitats. I saw one study, I think it was from Peru, and there was about 400 times as many of these malaria vectoring mosquitoes in urban and peri-urban and rural areas as in intact blocks of forest. So that's a pattern that's being pretty commonly picked up. Now, that having been said, so those are some of the guilds in which we're seeing changes. Other guilds, we're not seeing a lot of change. Many guilds, we don't feel like we have a very good handle in terms of what's going on. It's just telling us that the experts out there. So if you look at this includes a lot of things. Well, bats, of course, some plant groups, but a lot of things like fish and reptiles and amphibians, and also many of the invertebrate groups are not, the experts just don't feel they have adequate knowledge, or there's not information on those at a large enough number of sites in order to make much inference at all. So there's a lot about sort of the nuts and bolts biology, particularly for more cryptic kinds of creatures for which we simply don't have very good information, or if we have information, it's very patchy with just a few sites in which people know something about it. And then we can talk about environmental drivers, of course, the various kinds of changes that could be happening and potentially driving some of these changes here. First of all, there were some real surprises to me, And that is that we found several things were not changing significantly. Again, there's variability. Some sites it's changing, some sites not, but no consistent overall trends among things like forest cover. Now, one thing I should emphasize, a lot of these sites actually have become protected areas. They were unprotected, and then they've become protected areas, and the experts have been there all through the course of this happening. And so, in fact, you might predict in some cases, we don't necessarily predict that everything should be getting worse, everything should be going south. In fact, some sites have become gazetted or have had improvements in their environmental enforcement or reserves or park rangers or whatever that are managing the sites. And so it's interesting here we're seeing that natural forest cover around the reserves, in fact, is not declining significantly. There's variability among different sites. The same thing for hunting. This was a big surprise to me. I expected to see the slight tendency towards increasing hunting, but overall, no significant trend. And at this stage, for where we are right now, I think that the trend must be, part of this must be attributable to the fact that we're seeing an increase in environmental enforcement and protection within some of these protected areas. Fires also, most people are judging fires are not increasing. A very strong pattern of no change there, as you can see, in terms of fire frequency. Logging also, this is another one. Look at this. Logging is actually not quite statistically significant, but there's an excess of sites showing a decline in logging over time. And that would be within the park itself, inside the reserve. So I think this must be a consequence of better enforcement. And there's other drivers that are not showing much change either, and this includes various things like illegal gold mining, grazing and pastoralism, rainfall, river stream flows, and seed prediction. These are factors for which we're not showing any change. In some cases because of limited information, but in other cases people just don't think that they're changing. Now, that having been said, there are various factors which do seem to be falling out as having a strong consensus that there's the changes occurring. One of these is just generally air pollution, and you can see here most people think that air pollution is increasing around more reserves than it's declining. Water pollution, same thing. Again, many sites with no change, but certainly an excess of sites showing an increase in water pollution. River and stream sedimentation, which could occur, of course, as a consequence of land use change, land cover, removing forest cover and getting a lot of erosion and sedimentation in stream systems. Like, for example, when you get logging or forest clearing, you can see many sites showing an increase in that. Rising temperatures, some sites with no change, but nobody thinks it's getting cooler. People, if they think anything, it's getting hotter. Droughts, the same kind of a thing. Many people nobody thinking that there's fewer droughts. The overall pattern being people thinking that there's an increase in drought incidents. Road construction, again, a strong pattern. Strong excess of sites showing an increase in roading in and around the nature reserves. Automobile traffic, similarly, same thing. Almost, if there's going to be any trend at all, nobody thinks that there's fewer cars than there were before. If anything, it's increasing. And also nearby human populations. This is something that you might want to talk about later. But most sites are showing an increase in the human populations, or the experts are judging that to be happening around the reserves relative to the previous couple of decades. So what does all this mean? Are we chicken littles? Do we just think the sky is falling, or do we think that there's some serious changes here? And so in sort of trying to pull some of this together, I think some of the broad patterns we can look at. First of all, in general, one of the messages is that many more sites seem to be getting worse than are getting better. Okay, if we look at a lot of our environmental variables here in which we're getting substantial change, in most cases, there's many more reserves that are being judged to have worsening conditions that are judged to be having better conditions. So that's the one key overall trend. There's not that many cases where people think things are getting better. There's quite a few environmental variables where people think overall things are getting worse. Some of the drivers, as we mentioned, things like deforestation, logging, fires, can't remember what other things I was mentioning, but several of the environmental variables are stable in a few cases, hunting, but in a few cases, such as logging, they might even be getting better. It's not statistically significant, but nonetheless, many of the other drivers are worsening, according to the experts. So droughts, traffic, road construction, pollution, human populations, water pollution, sedimentation, temperature, non-timber harvests. The consensus for a lot of those variables is so the situation is worsening. In general, one of the things that's nice, I guess in a sense, is that there's internal consistency in the data, broadly speaking. If the drivers are judged to be getting worse overall, and this is a very simple analysis, all we're doing is simply looking across all the drivers and asking which of those drivers are showing significantly worsening conditions across those proportions of sites. And we then, and I've just ArcSciSquare, we've transformed the data. But here you can see that if the drivers are getting worse, according to the experts in general, the environmental conditions, the abundances of the gills are also getting worse. More of those are being impacted. So there's a positive correlation here. Quite a lot of scatter, but still, overall, it's statistically significant, which is what we would probably hope for. And that is in the sense that if the drivers are getting worse, the environmental conditions within the reserve are getting worse. Generally speaking, smaller reserves are more vulnerable. And again, we're looking at each site, comparing each site to itself over time, but there does seem to be a pattern in which the smaller reserves are deteriorating the most in terms of the proportions of gills that are getting worse over time. And we can look at some of the other key parameters that seem to be associated with degradation. So what I've done here is I've calculated, again, very simple preliminary analyses really. I've just asked what proportion of the gills show significant evidence of worsening, and summed that for each site. And then what we have here is the mean, and those are standard deviations across categories of sites that are having decreasing human populations, no change in human populations, and increasing human populations. And you can see here, it's not statistically significant, but it does look, maybe with larger sample sizes, that sites that have growing human populations have more environmental deterioration, and declining populations seem to have less environmental deterioration. So that's not it's suggestive, but it's not significant yet. Declining forest cover, we do get almost a significant pattern here. So if you're losing forest cover, there does seem to be more environmental degradation occurring than if you're gaining forest cover. And the strongest pattern that we have so far is roads. If you've got roads proliferating around or in the reserve, there's a strong difference here between the environmental degradation if you've got declining roads versus increasing roads here. So that's a strong significant effect in a one way and over. Again, very preliminary provisional analysis here. But so what can we conclude from all this so far? Well, I think the main take-home messages here is that many tropical reserves are being altered, and in some cases they're being seriously altered. Many of the gills are declining, but there's also an awful lot that we don't know about invertebrates, about bats, about some plant groups, about many invertebrate groups. There's a lot of groups that we just simply don't have very good barometers of change across the majority of sites. Threats are pretty eclectic. There's a lot of variability among threats, but there are still some common themes here. Issues like climate change, air and water pollution, freshwater ecosystems really are not doing very well in many cases. Growing populations, increasing isolation, and particularly road expansion and proliferation seems to be a key correlate of vulnerability. Again, using some very rough indices up at this point. And just in general, then, I think many reserves are too small and poorly protected, probably to buffer against many kinds of environmental threats, and then also, of course, climate change within the future. So that's my story, and that's what I'm sticking with.